What's going on, guys? This is the Red Rogue, and I have part 2 of my 8.3 Outlaw Rogue guide here for you. If you haven't seen the first half, I'll leave a link on the screen somewhere. This video is going to cover the gear-oriented section of the guide. You know, things like Azurite Traits, Essences, Corruption, good weapons and trinkets you should try to get, that kind of stuff. I forgot to mention it in my video last time, but I'll be putting the timestamps for each section in the comments below, so if you want to skip around or need to jump to a particular section, well, there you go. I'll start with Azurite Traits, as they're the first thing you'll come across in your leveling process and contribute a sizable amount to the playstyle of Outlaw, depending on which ones you're using. If you're really new to Battle for Azeroth, Azurite armor is basically what replaced Tyr, because unanimously we all hated Tyr and wanted it to go away apparently. Tyr was a set of armor that gave specific buffs and bonuses for each spec in the game and gave multiple bonuses based on how many pieces of Tyr you were wearing, if you're new to all of this. Azurite armor consists of the helmet, shoulders, and chest piece slots of gear. Each piece of Azurite armor will have traits you can select for your currently active specialization, and to unlock them requires your Heart of Azeroth to have high enough artifact power level to correspond to the level of the armor. The Azurite armor UI will let you know how much AP you need to unlock a ring on each piece of gear. Anyways, there are literally dozens of different Azurite traits that can be on your armor, so I'll cover the Outlaw specific ones that I recommend using, and then include some of the generic ones too. Any class-specific damaging trait will only show up on the 2 outermost rings if it's an epic quality armor piece, or only on the outermost ring if it's a superior quality piece. The most desirable Outlaw-specific traits in alphabetical order consist of Ace Up Your Sleeve, Brigand's Blitz, Deadshot, and Keep Your Wits About You. Ace Up Your Sleeve increases the damage of your Between the Eyes finishing move by a certain amount per combo point spent on it, and gives a 2% chance per combo point spent to give you 4 free combo points. This is a popular trait to stack multiple of due to our reliance on Crit Strike, and because of the Roll the Bones buff Ruthless Precision, which gives a 60% bonus to chance to crit with Between the Eyes. Brigand's Blitz gives a rapidly stacking haste buff when you use the cooldown Adrenaline Rush. While haste is not our strongest stat, the amount of haste this gives when you're using your only DPS cooldown is pretty potent, so having one of these isn't mandatory per se, but it does help quite a bit to speed up your rotation, especially if you're very heavily optimized for a crit verse build. Deadshot increases the damage of your next pistol shot after you've used Between the Eyes by a sizable amount. This is the other Azurite trait you should ideally try to get as many as you can of, as it shares strong synergy with your talent Quick Draw. It's very easy to have your Deadshots critting for almost as hard as your Between the Eyes if you have 3 of these, making this ranged combo point generator become a very powerful move in your toolkit. And as I mentioned in my other video, both Pistol Shot and Between the Eyes are affected by Blade Flurry, so having these moves crit that hard and spreading the damage is very, very strong. Lastly is Keep Your Wits About You. This is one of those Azurite traits that is quite literally mandatory for anything other than a raw single target fight. It gives a minor boost to the damage of your Sinister Strike procs, but the real reason you need this trait is because while Blade Flurry is active, you will gain a stacking 3% bonus chance for Sinister Strike to proc. You gain 1 stack for every damaging move you do during Blade Flurry, meaning you will be very quickly rolling in free combo points and damage while this is active. This trait has amazing synergy with the Dancing Steel talent, as it gives you extra damage and more time to get stacks. On top of that, with Acrobatic Strikes, you can hit even more people with this. Seriously, if you aren't wearing this and you have it on your armor, you need to think about what you've done to yourself. You only need 1, so don't go too ham stacking these or anything, as the only thing that will stack is the damage bonus to Sinister Strike. As a side note, I highly recommend you make sure that this is on your highest level piece of Azurite armor, as this is one of the best traits that scales with both item level and the amount of AoE you do. Alright, so now we'll talk about the generic damaging traits for your armor. Worst case scenario, if you don't have all of the Outlaw specific ones on your gear, these will all still be solid options. Blightborn Infusion is a nice simple crit proc trait. At a high level, this can only come from Gorak Tool's Mantle, which is a pair of shoulders from Waycrest Manor. This is basically the best non-specific trait you can get, and is honestly one of the better pairs of Azurite shoulders you can get as a rogue in general, as it even has good traits for assassination and subtlety. Clockwork Heart is a proc of all 4 secondary stats, and occurs once a minute while in combat for 12 seconds. For leatherwearers, this can only come from the Operation Mechagon pieces, Extravagant Epaulets, or the Type 2 Bomber Jacket. Of the 2 of them, The epaulets are marginally better due to the minor Azurite trait Unstable Flames, if you were really wanting this stat proc trait in particular. Heart of Darkness is a new Azurite trait that was added in patch 8.3, and works off of the Corruption system. This trait gives a flat stat increase to all 4 secondary stats, as long as your Corruption level is above 25. This trait is on any piece of Azurite gear from the Raid, the Assaults, and the Horrific Visions, so it's pretty easy to get multiple of, and it's a nice, consistent stat buff, even if Mastery does suck butt. Lastly is Swirling Sands, another crit buff, though not quite as good as Blightborn Infusion. This one has a duration of 10 seconds, but if you crit during those 10 seconds, you will extend the duration of the buff by 1 second, which can occur up to 8 times. For Leather users, this can only drop from a single item at higher levels, the Hood of the Slithering Loa, which is a drop from Temple of Sethralis. Alright, now we're at the minor DPS traits, which in some cases are the real DPS difference between 2 similar pieces of Azurite gear. Unstable Flames is a small stacking crit buff. As I've already mentioned, crit is our go-to stat for most any scenario, so this is always a good choice. Stacking multiple of these stat traits will cause them to add their stat values together, so it isn't 2 separate procs if you have 2 of the same trait. Overwhelming Power is a haste buff that works backwards in comparison to Unstable Flames. It starts out at 25 stacks of the buff Overwhelming Power. This buff gives a small amount of haste per stack, and drops 1 stack every second or when you take damage. Due to this Azurite trait sims well on paper, but in a scenario where you're taking damage consistently, you will lose these stacks faster than the simulations anticipate in a lot of scenarios. Even still, this is a pretty potent trait, and it's our best trait for single target by a good margin while still being pretty competitive in AoE. These numbers are anticipating you using a pretty specific heavy crit verse build, so if you're using a lot of haste already, you might want to sim your gear to see if this is worth using or not for you. The defensive traits on your Azurite armor are honestly up to your discretion. However, I'm personally a fan of either Resounding Protection or Impassive Visage, as they're free damage mitigation and healing without any weird requirements like standing on 1 foot in between at least 5 mobs or whatever. Vampiric Speed is also a pretty good choice if you're doing a lot of Mythic Plus or you're fighting things where there's a lot of adds. Now that our Azurite gear is sorted out, we'll talk about Azurite Essences. These were added in patch 8.2, Rise of Ashara. These are basically abilities and passives you get to socket into your Heart of Azeroth once you reach certain levels of artifact power. Essences are earned from a wide variety of content, from Mythic Plus to raiding to PvP and more. There are a lot of essences in the game, so I'm basically just going to go over the ones I'd recommend as your majors and your minors as an Outlaw Rogue. The following are some pretty powerful major essences that you can use. Condensed Lifeforce is the DPS essence from the Eternal Palace raid of patch 8.2. The on-use ability will summon a Guardian of Azeroth for 30 seconds, which will pelt your target with Azurite spikes every couple seconds. It will also cause an AoE volley every 8 seconds, and give you a stacking haste buff every time it uses any moves. The minor effect of this essence will give you the chance to proc Azurite spikes of your own, and when you hit an enemy, you'll deal 3% more damage to that target for 6 seconds. Even in patch 8.3, this is basically the most popular single target essence for Outlaw. However, getting it's kind of a pain now, as you have to clear the Eternal Palace raid to earn Okayest Reliquaries, so you can make it. Meaning doing an irrelevant raid with irrelevant gear to get a good essence. Yeah, kinda sucks if you didn't do it at the time. Sorry guys. Blood of the Enemy is another exceptionally popular essence, as it's very strong for single target and outstanding in AoE. It is an AoE on-use burst ability that applies a double whammy debuff to all enemies hit. Any enemy with the debuff will take 25% more damage from your critical hits, and be 25% more likely to be critically hit. Being a spec with moves that already do quadruple damage when they crit, plus all the other stacking Azurite traits we can combine with it, means this is some exceptional burst damage. It also gives a nice stacking crit passive that turns into a haste proc when it reaches 40 stacks, which is a nice little bonus too. The biggest issue with this essence is that if you don't like PvP, you're gonna have a bad time. Getting the full power rank 3 version of this essence requires you to earn 30,000 honor from either PvP islands, battlegrounds, epic battlegrounds, or brawls, so yeah, you kinda gotta really want this if you're not a PvPer. It really is totally worth it though, because I hate PvP and it was worth getting. It's basically the best major essence you can have as a rogue. Another potentially potent single target option is Breath of the Dying, one of the new essences introduced with patch 8.3. This essence is acquired from reputation with the new Uldum Accord faction in Uldum. This essence is basically Crucible of the Flame on steroids, as it's a quick on-hit move, but has a reduced cooldown if you use it on an enemy above 80% health or below 20% health. The really sweet thing about this essence is that if you kill a target with it, the cooldown is set to a brisk 5 seconds and deals 100% more damage on the next use. This essence requires reaching Revered to buy the rank 3 variant, so again, not one you'll probably have super quick, but even at lower ranks, it's still not bad and it's very easy to get. And now for the minor essences. Memory of Lucid Dreams is basically the best and easiest minor essence you can get in the game. You basically just have to do dailies for technically a couple weeks if you want to get rank 3, and a little bit of the quest chain in Nazjatar. But even rank 1 is extremely potent, as it makes all of your moves that spend energy have a chance to refund half of that energy. Getting it up to rank 3 really just gives you a little bit more self-healing and a verse buff, so even without that, it's an amazing minor essence. Vision of Perfection is from Mechagon, and is basically just a flat cooldown reduction for Adrenaline Rush. The percent of cooldown reduction is affected by your Heart of Azeroth's AP level, and it caps out at level 84 for a total of 25% cooldown reduction. This one is slightly more popular for raiding, however, I'm quite partial to it for Mythic Plus too, so it's one of the ones I use pretty much all the time. You basically just have to run Mechagon Junkyard or Mechagon Workshop on either Heroic, Mythic, or Mythic Keystones until you get rank 1, and then the plans to craft rank 2, and then the progression sprockets to make rank 3. So yeah, you're gonna be in Mechagon a lot, sorry. Another Mechagon essence, Purification Protocol, is an AoE damage essence that blasts enemies and heals you over time. This essence also does 50% extra damage to aberrations, which makes it a nice minor in certain raid encounters, horrific visions, and dungeons in general if you want a little extra AoE damage. The only downside of this is you do have to be revered with the Rust Bolt resistance to get rank 3. So yeah, yay grinding. I mentioned Breath of the Dying as a major essence, but it's also a very strong minor essence for a couple reasons. It does a nice damaging proc that hits pretty often, but its main use is the extra 10 corruption resistance it gives you, which is exceptionally useful once you're running a lot of corruption. And lastly is Conflict and Strife. Conflict and Strife is another very popular minor essence, as it gives a sizable amount of versatility. Verse is basically our second best stat, and sometimes our best stat if we're actually a little low on it. The downside is this one requires getting an item that comes from your weekly PvP cache, and to make it, you need to do it every week, and to have a very high rating to get more of them so you're not doing it for forever. So, yeah. Okay, so now we're on to the juicy stuff, corruption. You know, that stuff that makes you do more damage, and then you get your teeth busted out of your face hole because you're wearing like 70 corruption, and it makes you look like you were dunked in strawberry jelly and completely ruined your transmog. Yeah, that stuff. I've done a few videos on these corruptions already, so if you want a deeper look into them, then you should probably take a peek at my other videos. Anyways, for single target, Twisted Appendage is a very popular corruption, as it's one of the few that can switch between targets without any damage loss, unlike Infinite Stars. For anything relating to AoE though, it's pretty underwhelming, as the Mind Flay ability that the Tentacle does doesn't cleave or do any AoE of any type. A solid rating option though. Gushing Wound is another very powerful single target corruption, even with the massive 35% nerf it received. This corruption again gains no benefit from AoE scenarios, as it's a simple damage over time effect. Because of this, it can potentially lose like a tiny bit of effectiveness if the target dies with the dot still active, but in raid scenarios that would very rarely be the case. It's also a very low cost corruption, so it'd be easy to slide a couple of these into your corruption loadout, and it's very potent for PvP, if that's what you're into. Twilight Devastation is a corruption I've had a love-hate relationship with since the beginning of this patch. It's a giant death tornado that deals damage based on a percentage of your max health, meaning it can hit very, very hard. When it hits. If it hits. It swerves around like crazy in a serpentine pattern as it moves towards the enemy, so it has the possibility of completely going around your target. It's also pretty weak in single target, unless you get some amazingly good luck, in which case it can still be decent. It's just a very fickle RNG mistress. Strike Through is a very solid performer in both single target and AoE, as it simply increases the damage your crits already do. Since we stack crit, This corruption sees good potential use for a nice consistent damage increase, which is always nice. It's also much better in single target than Twilight Devastation, though not quite as good as Twisted Appendage or Gushing Wound, so the choice comes down to if you're willing to gamble with procs, or if you want something that's good in both AoE and single target. Severe goes hand in hand with Strike Through, as the more crit you have, the more likely you are to crit, meaning they'll do more damage when you're wearing Strike Through. If you're going this route, you will ideally have an even balance of the two corruptions, and you'll want to have a very large baseline amount of crit. I would suggest probably a minimum of like 1900 crit prior to you using any severes. So this might be a hard amount to reach if your gear isn't well optimized stat-wise or if you don't have a lot of sockets. Obviously, the higher the crit, the more useful severe is to you. While it won't be a huge damage increase or life-changing corruption, having an ineffable truth can help increase your Blade Flurry uptime, get your CCs off cooldown faster, and speed up the recovery rate of your defensives too. You'd probably only want one, maybe two at the most, however, as Outlaw does not see the throughput increase that other specs will, and it honestly is more so of a quality of life type thing. The Blade Flurry uptime bonus is pretty nice though. Lastly, and probably the most coveted corruption for any Agi melee DPS is Lash of the Void. This is basically one of those corruptions you have to get. On top of that, you have to get two. This tentacle slapping corruption comes off of the Raw Den specific weapon, the Unduant Caress, meaning you need to raid and spend like a billion bonus rolls to get these. They're by and far the best all-around corruption you can wear, as they're best in slot for Mythic Plus or just cleave in general, and they're even potent in terms of single target throughput because of how consistent the proc is. Speaking of crit, let's talk about trinkets. One of the best trinkets you can get yourself as an Outlaw Rogue is the Deadeye Spyglass, which comes from running Siege of Borealis, or if you're absurdly lucky, then maybe just from your Mythic Plus weekly cache. This trinket is very powerful for us, as the stacking crit is quite high, and it becomes even more badass with the Strike Through / severe setup of corruptions. The Ashvane's Razor Coral is another crit trinket. However, this one will require a little more work to get your hands on. This one comes from Lady Ashvane, a boss in the Eternal Palace in Nazjatar. Honestly, you'd really want a mythic version of this if you were going to wear it in patch 8.3, as a 430 trinket is honestly pretty low for the potential amount of stats you'd gain from other higher level trinkets. Torment Najar is another popular option, and drops from Inquisitor Xanash in Nyalotha. This trinket does some nice consistent AoE damage ticks and eventually builds up to a large AoE hit. Overall, a solid trinket with no need to worry about on-use effects like with the Razor Coral. While not a best-in-slot trinket, the Kultiran Cannonball Runner is actually not a half-bad trinket anymore. It's a simple damage proc that deals a frontal cone of damage and deals more damage if it hits multiple targets. It also drops a freaking cannon from the sky to besiege your enemies, which as an Outlaw Rogue just screams class fantasy, so it's freaking cool. Okay, so this is more so a recommendation for what weapons you should get until you can get your hands on a pair of Unduant Caresses, because, yeah, you're gonna want to get the Unduant Caresses, because tentacles. The Unduant Caress is bar none the best option for multiple targets, and is still very strong in single target. However, these alternatives will give you a solid little single target damage boost until you get them. The Salvaged Incendiary tool from Operation Mechagon Junkyard is a really badass looking blowtorch weapon that applies a fire debuff. Pretty self-explanatory, but does a fair amount of single target damage. Your other option would be the Bile-Stained Krog Tusk from the Underrot. These were at one point the best Agi one-handed weapons in the game, as nothing else had a damage proc specific to them. They're still quite nice to have for raw single target damage, but are unfortunately outclassed by the Unduant Caress's tentacle slapping goodness. I think the last part of this guide is going to be a rotation / tips and tricks video, so we can put all this knowledge to good use and crush some DPS meters. However, I think that's all I've got in me for this video, as these last couple ones have taken a lot of time to put together. I hope they're useful for you guys though, so feel free to leave a comment below, and if you liked this video and my others, maybe a like or a sub. Thank you all so much for watching, this is the Red Rogue, and I'll see you guys around.